Settle in and let your breathing slow, the kind of slow that matches the tide. Outside, the air feels salt clean, and the road noise is just a distant hush, like a radio turned down in the next room. Tonight, you are walking a quiet stretch of Long Island shoreline with a small flashlight and a folder that never really closes. You might think a beach is too open to keep secrets for long, but wind buries, water moves, and emptiness forgets. In this Sleepless Detective Hour, you will follow the case we call Gilgo Beach, gently and patiently. Not for shocks, but for the soft reasons it still refuses to settle into an ending. You learn early in this job that open places can be the best hiding places. Not because they are complicated, but because people assume somebody else already looked. A marsh is just a marsh. A thicket is just a thicket. A shoulder on the side of a parkway is just dead space you pass at 60 miles an hour. Eyes forward, thoughts elsewhere. Out here, the wind does most of the talking. It moves sand the way a bored clerk moves paperwork, one thin sheet at a time, until the old truth is under something new. The tide does the same, dragging seaweed and trash in and pulling it back out again, like it cannot decide what belongs. And the emptiness is patient. It does not rush. It does not brag. It just holds what you give it. Gilgo Beach, as a name, sounds like a place for sunburn and lukewarm soda. In the case file, it becomes something colder, a stretch of South Shore coastline where for a long time the ground kept accepting the same kind of secret. This is what people mean when they say dumping ground. Not a dramatic pit in the earth, just a convenient strip of neglected landscape where a driver can pull off, step into brush, and come back out with clean shoes if they are careful. The first thing you notice is how ordinary the access is. The road is not a haunted lane. It is a parkway, a ribbon of asphalt with rules and signs and traffic. That is the trick. A remote place does not have to be far away. It just has to be ignored. You sweep your flashlight low across brittle grass and salt-bent brush. The beam catches on little things, bottle caps, a crushed cup, the pale bones of driftwood, all the harmless leftovers of people who came here to do normal things. And you think, for a moment, that this is how it always starts, with a normal place that gets used for something it was never meant to hold. You also think you know what happened. You think it is one bad night, one isolated tragedy, a single story that can be summarized and filed. Random, senseless. But that is the story your brain tells itself, so it can sleep. The real story is slower. The real story is a pattern you do not see at first, because it is spread out like footprints in sand, blurred at the edges, half erased, and separated by long stretches of nothing. And once you have stood in that quiet, you naturally start asking the first easy question: how did anyone even find anything out there? It is almost never because a detective had a brilliant intuition. It is usually because life trips over death by accident. A search begins for one reason and ends up uncovering another. The file will tell you dates and agency names, and it will sound neat on paper. In real life, it feels like fumbling for your keys in the dark and touching something sharp you did not expect. The early part of the Gilgo Beach story begins with a search for a missing person. A young woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared after visiting Oak Beach in early May of 2010. Oak Beach is a gated community on a barrier island, not far from where you are standing now. It is the kind of place that looks sleepy from the outside. Little houses, narrow roads, the sense that nothing really happens there unless someone brings it with them. Shannon had been working as an escort. That word tends to make people talk louder or talk crueler or stop listening altogether. But in an investigation, your job is to strip away the noise and keep the facts. A person is missing. A timeline exists. Someone last saw her alive. Phones were used, calls were made. People remember pieces and forget the rest. On the night she vanished, there were phone calls, confusion, and movement through the neighborhood. She called for help. Others called too. There are different accounts of what was said and what was heard and what was believed. That is normal in the worst way. Humans under stress do not become better witnesses. They become human. After she disappeared, search efforts began. They were not continuous, not clean, not cinematic. Search efforts are often stop and start. A day with resources, a day without. Weather, scheduling, jurisdiction. Somebody signs off, somebody else signs on. The ocean does not care about any of that. The ocean just keeps doing what it does. Months later, in December of 2010, law enforcement expanded the search along Ocean Parkway, the long road that runs beside these dunes and marshy thickets. You can picture it now because you are here, a narrow shoulder, dense brush, and behind it, the Great South Bay on one side and the Atlantic beyond the dunes on the other. A landscape that seems flat until you try walking through it. Then it becomes a slow fight with branches and soft ground. During that expanded search, a canine unit found something. Not Shannon, someone else. And then, because finding one body changes the way you look at every patch of brush, they found another, and then another, and then discoveries tend to come in clusters for a simple reason. The first find breaks your assumptions. It tells you the unthinkable is possible in a place you have driven past 100 times. After that, every officer with a flashlight starts scanning differently. Every dog handler slows down. Every patch of ground becomes suspicious. You stop seeing just weeds and start seeing cover. Those first 4 sets of remains were women, and they were found along the same general stretch. Later, investigators would connect them to online escort advertisements and to contacts made by phone. The press would give them a label, the Gilgo 4. It is a tidy name for something that is not tidy at all. And as the search continued, more remains were found in the broader area. Some were closer to Manorville, further inland. Some were partial remains. Some belonged to victims whose identities were not immediately known. The geography widened, and so did the questions, because when you find multiple victims across time and space, your brain tries to decide which story is less frightening. Story 1 is that one offender did this, repeatedly, calmly, with familiarity. Story 2 is that this is a tragic coincidence. Multiple unrelated offenders using similar terrain for disposal. Both stories are possible in theory. Both stories have consequences in practice. In the early days, there was genuine confusion about whether the discoveries pointed to one person's work or several. The remains were found in different states of decomposition and in different areas and with different circumstances. Some victims were associated with sex work. Some were not clearly associated at all. Some were male. At least one was a toddler. The case began to feel less like one straight line, and more like a knot. And knots do not untie themselves. They tighten, especially when the public wants a simple answer and the evidence refuses to cooperate. So you do what you always do when the questions pile up. You make a list. You mark a map. You try to see a pattern. You lay the map out in your mind the way you would lay it out on a metal table under buzzing lights. Long Island stretches like an arm into the Atlantic. The South Shore is lined with barrier islands and thin strips of land, broken by inlets. The names come like a slow roll call: Jones Beach, Wantagh, Massapequa, Oak Beach, Gilgo, Tobay. Some of them sound like summer. In this file, they sound like coordinates. The geography matters because offenders are rarely as clever as people imagine. Most of them do not have a master plan. They have habits. They have comfort zones. They have roads they like to drive and turnoffs they know, and places where they have learned by repetition that nobody is watching. Ocean Parkway is one of those roads that can feel invisible at night, even though it is not truly remote. During the day, it is traffic and cyclists and beachgoers. At night, especially off-season, it becomes a corridor of darkness. Headlights pass, tail lights fade, the brush stays black and thick. Distance plays tricks too. On a daytime map, Oak Beach, Gilgo Beach, and other points along the parkway look close together. A few miles, a short drive. But in darkness, a few miles can feel like a world. The same way a short walk down an unlit hallway feels longer than it is. Your mind counts shadows instead of steps, and the terrain here does a quiet kind of protecting. Not protecting people, protecting what is hidden. The bramble and scrub can be dense enough to block a line of sight from the road. The marsh can swallow footprints. The salt air can corrode metal. Rain can press down the grass and then lift it again. If you have ever lost something small in tall weeds, you already understand the principle. Scale it up and make it cruel. This is also why beaches and coastal brush can hide things for a long time. Not because they are magical, because the environment is constantly rearranging the surface. Sand shifts, leaves fall, snow comes briefly, then melts. The scene does not stay frozen. The scene keeps being edited. There is another practical reason too. People do not search these places thoroughly unless they have a reason. The shoulder of a parkway is not a hiking trail. It is not where families stroll. It is not where you expect to find anything except litter. So it is easy to drive by for years and never step into the brush. And what is not stepped on is not found. Remote is sometimes just ignored space, a strip of land everyone sees, but nobody enters. That is a gift. If you are the kind of person who thinks in gifts like that, you stand with your flashlight and let the reality of that settle, not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. The way you accept that a lock is only as strong as the door frame. The way you accept that a city can be loud and still hide violence in plain sight. Here, the hiding place is not a basement. It is the edge of the road. Once the place makes a kind of grim sense, your attention drifts to the people behind the names, the ones the headlines often flatten. In every long case, there is a moment when the victims become more famous than they ever wanted to be. Their worst day becomes a public object. People discuss them like symbols. They argue about their choices as if choices are armor. They forget that a person is not a headline. A person is routines. A person is a phone charging on a kitchen counter. A person is a plan for next week. Some of the women connected to the Gilgo discoveries were identified relatively quickly. Others were not. Identification is not always immediate, even with modern tools. Sometimes there are fingerprints and dental records and clear matches. Sometimes there is nothing but bone and time and a DNA profile that has nowhere to go until someone in a family submits their own sample. Sometimes the name comes years later, like a letter delivered to the wrong address for a long time. The emotional arithmetic for families is brutal and boring at the same time. Boring because it is paperwork and phone calls and waiting. Brutal because it is a second life you did not ask for. The before life and the afterlife. In the before life, you argue about groceries and birthdays and who forgot to call. In the afterlife, you learn terms like remains and identification and notification, and you get used to hearing your loved one described in clinical language. You learn to translate that language back into a person. Public attention is uneven too. It is one of the ugliest quiet facts in true crime. Some victims get wall-to-wall coverage. Others are treated like footnotes. If a victim did sex work or struggled with addiction or lived on the edge of stability, the world often acts like they were less missing, less worth the late-night search, less worth the hard questions. But the file does not work that way. At least, not if you are doing your job with any decency left. The file holds names and dates and known movements. It holds the weight of what was taken. Your task in the quiet hours is to remember that each line is a person who once had a morning routine. Each line is somebody who laughed at something stupid. Each line is a life that ended unfairly. And because this is a sleep-friendly hour, you do not linger on graphic detail. You do not need it. The horror is already present in the simplest fact that multiple people were left in the brush like discarded objects. That is enough to understand the kind of disregard involved. When investigators talk about patterns, they talk about victimology. It sounds academic. It is actually just a structured way of asking, who was this person and why might they have been targeted? In Gilgo, some victims were associated with escorting and online advertisements. That can create a practical vulnerability. Meetings arranged with strangers, movement at odd hours, a reluctance to involve police when something feels wrong, because involving police has often gone badly. You know this because you have seen it. The people who are most at risk are often the people least protected by the systems that claim to protect everyone. Congratulations. You have discovered a basic truth of policing in society. It is not comforting. It is just true. The identification delays added to the ache. When a victim is unidentified, families somewhere are still searching without knowing they should be mourning. Meanwhile, the investigation has a blank space where a life story should be. Even a good detective struggles when the victim is a silhouette. Connections are harder to make. Associates are harder to locate. Timelines are harder to confirm. So the case becomes a long table with too many empty chairs. Some chairs get names quickly. Others sit unclaimed for years. And all of it happens under the same indifferent wind. And as you sit with those names, you start to notice how an investigation is not just police work, it is also time, paperwork, and waiting. The public loves the myth of the breakthrough. One smart detective, one sudden realization, one dramatic confrontation. The reality is quieter and usually uglier. The reality is a lot of people doing a lot of small things slowly while trying not to drop the thread. You picture the machinery behind the scenes, reports that need to be written in a specific format, evidence that must be logged, sealed, transported, stored, chain of custody, which is a fancy way of saying if you cannot prove who touched it and when, a defense attorney will turn your case into confetti. You picture interviews, some in living rooms with family photos on the wall, some in fluorescent lit rooms where everyone feels defensive, witnesses who remember a vehicle but not the plate, a voice but not the words, a date but not the year, and you nod and take notes anyway because memory is not a recording. It is a storyteller that changes its own story. There are also the layers of jurisdiction. In a place like Long Island, you can have local police, county police, state police, federal involvement, depending on the angle. Each agency has its own culture, its own pride, its own paperwork. Cooperation happens, but it is never as smooth as the press releases suggest. There are meetings, there are disagreements, there are moments where information sits in one office while another office badly needs it. Leadership changes too. Command, staff, retire. Elected officials come and go. A new person takes over and wants to do things their way. Cases lose momentum during transitions, not because anyone is evil, but because bureaucracy is a creature that moves slowly even when people are trying. Limited resources are another quiet problem. Every hour spent on one case is an hour not spent on another. Every lab test costs time and money. Every search requires personnel, equipment, planning. And while the public imagines unlimited manpower, the truth is that most departments are triaging constantly. The loudest emergencies get attention. The quiet, complicated ones wait. Tips arrive in waves after a major news story, after an anniversary, after a documentary, after somebody hears a rumor at a bar and decides years later that maybe they should say something. Many tips are useless. Some are cruel. Some are well-intentioned and wrong. And a few are the kind that make you sit up straighter because they contain a detail that cannot be guessed. But sorting tips is its own form of exhaustion. Someone has to take the call. Someone has to write it up. Someone has to follow it, even if it leads nowhere. There is no montage for that. It is a slow grind of human effort. Missteps happen in long cases. Evidence not handled the way you would want. Information not shared fast enough. Opportunities missed. You can say it gently because you do not need outrage to understand consequence. In an investigation, early decisions echo for years. If you fail to canvass an area thoroughly at the right moment, witnesses move. If you fail to seize a phone quickly, data disappears. If you misunderstand a timeline, you build a theory on sand, and sand, as you have noticed tonight, does not like holding its shape. The breakthroughs that do happen usually come from persistence, not brilliance. Somebody rereads an old report and notices a small inconsistency. Somebody retests a piece of evidence with newer methods. Somebody finally talks Somebody's alibi cracks because time makes people sloppy. That is the slow machinery. It is not romantic. It is not fast. It is, however, the only way most cases ever move. And after enough waiting, you start leaning on the quiet helpers, small pieces of evidence that can speak without raising their voice. Evidence is often described like it is a magic key. In reality, most evidence is more like a smudged note you found in a pocket after the laundry. It tells you something. It does not tell you everything. It needs context. It needs patience. In a coastal case like this, time is an enemy. Weather and salt and water wear things down. Fabric breaks apart. Paper dissolves. Metals corrode. The sun bleaches. The ground shifts. Even the bones themselves can be affected by the environment. People imagine a body as a stable object. It is not. It changes, and the scene changes with it. So, investigators look for what survives: clothing, jewelry, personal items. Sometimes, those items help identify a victim. Sometimes they suggest where the victim might have been last seen, or how they lived. Sometimes they suggest nothing at all, because plenty of clothing is common. A plain black top is not a clue by itself. It becomes a clue only when you connect it to a missing person report, or a photograph, or a memory. Location is evidence too, not just the general place, but the exact placement. The distance from the road, the type of brush, the proximity to certain access points. Was it easy to carry something in? Or would it have required effort? Effort suggests time. Time suggests confidence. Confidence suggests familiarity. It is not a straight line to a name, but it is a line to a kind of person. Timelines matter as well, even when they are imperfect. When was someone last known to be alive? When did their phone last connect? When did they last log into an account? When did they speak to a friend? Each answer is a small peg in the board. You string the pegs with thread and hope the shape becomes clearer. Phones are an entire universe of clues, but even that universe has limits. People talk about phone pings like they are precise dots on a map. Often, they are not. A ping can place a phone within a broad area depending on tower density and terrain. It can show direction and pattern and gaps. It can show that two phones were in the same general place at similar times. It can also show nothing if a phone is turned off, discarded, or never recovered. Digital traces can be fragile too. Records get deleted. Companies change retention policies. Accounts are created with false names. Prepaid phones, sometimes called burner phones, are used and tossed. In the time period around 2010, online escort advertising and communication were already common, but the digital infrastructure was not what it is today. Some data existed, some did not. Some was easy to get, some required legal process and time. Evidence often answers when better than it answers who. It can tell you that something likely happened in a window of time. It can tell you that remains were deposited in a place that suggests planning. But turning that into a prosecutable case, that is a different problem. Because in court, suspicion is not enough. Patterns are not enough. Even a strong theory is not enough. You need sturdy proof that can survive cross-examination. You need to show not only that someone could have done it, but that they did. This is where the Gilgo case has long felt frustrating. There are clues, yes, There are patterns, yes. There is a sense of a person who knows the area, yes. But the case does not want to line up into one clean arrow pointing at one clean target. It splinters. It raises the question of whether all the remains belong to one offender's actions or whether the shoreline became a shared graveyard for separate tragedies. And when the physical clues do not settle it, you are left with the human world, habits, routines, and the kinds of people who pass unnoticed. You start to picture the offender not as a movie monster, but as a practical problem. Someone who can move through this space without drawing attention. Someone who knows where to pull over without getting stuck. Someone who knows how long it takes for a patrol car to pass, if patrol cars pass at all. Someone who understands the rhythm of the place. Familiarity matters. A person who is local or who works locally has an advantage. They know shortcuts. They know when the beaches empty out. They know which stretches of the parkway are darker. They know where a vehicle can stop briefly without being memorable. They do not have to be a genius. They just have to be comfortable. Comfort is the scary part because comfort looks ordinary. An offender like this does not need to be visibly strange. They can be a neighbor, a coworker, the person in front of you at a deli arguing about a sandwich like it is the most important thing in the world. That is often how these cases feel. The suspect is not a shadowy stranger. The suspect is someone who blends. Planning can be minimal too. People imagine elaborate staging. Sometimes it is just repeated behavior. Do the same thing enough times and you get better at it. Not because you are brilliant, because practice makes you efficient. The way you learn your commute, the way you learn which grocery line moves fastest. The same human brain principle applied to something rotten. There are also questions about how victims were contacted and what methods were used. In cases tied to escort advertising, an offender may use phones and aliases, presenting as a client. That creates a pattern of outreach that can be traced, sometimes, if records exist and if investigators can connect the dots. But it also creates a wide field of possible suspects because many people contact escorts. The difference is in the details, repeated contacts, specific language, timing, and the kinds of calls that end abruptly. And there is the big question that sits like a stone in your pocket. One offender or more than one? Connection or coincidence? The answer matters because it changes how you interpret everything. If it is one person, the commonalities become a signature. If it is multiple, the commonalities may just be geography and vulnerability. You can hold those possibilities gently without forcing them. Good investigation is sometimes just the ability to wait without lying to yourself, to say, "We do not know yet," and not fill the silence with fantasy. And because one case can feel too heavy to hold alone, your mind wanders quietly to other crimes that also refuse to resolve neatly. You let the shoreline case drift to the edge of your thoughts, and you pick up two other files that sit nearby, like thin paperbacks nobody finished, not because they are famous, because they are ordinary in the way unsolved things often are. A missing hour, a door that should have been locked, a witness who saw something and then spent years doubting their own eyes. In the first file, you are not standing on a beach. You are standing in a parking lot that smells faintly of asphalt and spilled coffee. It is the kind of place you have driven through without ever noticing. a grocery store on a main road, a bank of lights overhead, too bright for the hour, casting hard shadows under cars. You think, at first, this will be simple. Somebody disappears from a place with cameras. People come and go. Receipts exist. A timeline should be easy. Wrong, because the cameras are pointed at the doors, not the far corners. Because one light has been out for months. Because the footage loops and overwrites faster than anyone wants to admit. Because the manager is on vacation and nobody knows the password to the system. And by the time you get access, you are watching a night that has already replaced itself. You walk the perimeter anyway. You do the boring work. You look for the dropped object, the scuff mark, the cigarette butt that does not belong. You learn to love the small humiliations of reality, the way a case can hinge on whether a clerk remembered to change the trash bag. A witness tells you they saw a person arguing near a dark sedan. They say the driver was a man, maybe. They say the car was blue or black, depending on the streetlight. Their certainty dissolves under questions, not because they are lying, but because memory is soft. Congratulations, you have just met the enemy you cannot arrest. You pull phone records later when you finally have the paperwork done. You stare at the list of calls like it is a foreign language. Numbers with no names, a few contacts that make sense. And then, right around the missing hour, a quiet gap. Not proof of anything, just a shape where activity should have been. You learn the first theme of the unsolved case. Not evil genius, just thin evidence. A life can vanish in the space between two ordinary errands, and the world keeps selling groceries like it never happened. So, you set that file down, and you reach for the second one. This one smells like old carpet and rain. You are in a small apartment building, the kind with a buzzer that only half works. The hallway is narrow, and someone has tried to cover the smell of cigarettes with vanilla air freshener. It does not work. It never works. A neighbor called it in as a welfare check. They had not seen the tenant in a while. That is how it starts sometimes, not with a scream. With absence, you knock, you announce yourself, you listen. Nothing. You get the key from a landlord who acts annoyed, as if inconvenience is the true crime. The door opens reluctantly, sticking in the frame. The air inside is stale, and the silence has weight. Again, you think this will be simple. If something happened here, there will be signs. And then you find the signs are almost nothing. A cup in the sink, a television remote on the couch, shoes by the door, lined up like the person expected to come right back. There is no struggle, no dramatic mess, no message written in lipstick on a mirror. Real life rarely provides that kind of courtesy. You look for the practical things: wallet, keys, phone, medications, the stuff that tells you whether someone left voluntarily or left in a hurry or never left at all. The phone is gone. That matters. It matters in a quiet way. The neighbor upstairs says they heard footsteps late, but they are not sure which night. They say there was a car door slam. They say it could have been nothing. They say they do not want trouble. They say everything people say when they want to be helpful and invisible at the same time. You canvass anyway. You take the same statements a dozen times because humans repeat themselves with new details when they feel safe. You find out the missing person had a routine, a corner store, a bus stop, a call to a sister every Sunday, and then, one Sunday, No call. Years later, detectives revisit it. New eyes, better tools. They run DNA from a hair found on a jacket. They pull old cell tower logs that were once too expensive to analyze. They check license plate readers that did not exist when the person vanished. The technology changes, but the human part stays stubborn. People still forget. People still lie. People still move away. In both little files, you notice the shared themes. Missed timing, evidence that thins out like fog under sunlight. Witnesses who are unsure. Communities that keep living around a blank space, pretending it does not bother them. And that is the point of these detours. Not to overwhelm you, to show you how unsolved cases feel from inside the paperwork. Not like cliffhangers, like rooms you cannot fully search because the lights are bad and the door keeps swinging shut. So you let those two ordinary mysteries settle back into their boxes, and you return to the Shoreline case with a question that is almost insultingly simple. What exactly keeps it from closing? You stand again on the side of Ocean Parkway in your mind. Cars pass in the distance, their sound softened by wind. The brush looks the same as it did yesterday and last year and a decade ago. And you think about how the world imagines an unsolved case as a dramatic failure. Often, it is just time. Time passed, and the environment did what environments do. Salt, air, and moisture and heat cycles broke things down. Items that might have held fingerprints were exposed, handled, moved, degraded. Biological material that could have helped was diluted by rain and baked by sun and scattered by scavengers. The coast does not preserve like a dry desert does. It edits, it rearranges. The first simple reason the case feels open is that it began with confusion. The initial discoveries were not part of a single neat crime scene. They were multiple scenes, spread along miles, discovered in stages. When you find remains in brush, you are already behind. You are walking into an ending and trying to rewind it. Then there is the second reason. Too many leads can be worse than too few. People think investigators want more tips. Always. They do, in theory, but each tip is a thread, and most threads are attached to nothing. Someone says their cousin knew a guy who drove that road. Someone says they saw a suspicious truck. Someone says they heard a rumor about a cop. Someone says the victims were involved with this person or that person, or a whole imaginary network that exists only in late-night paranoia. You still have to check. You still have to document. You still have to clear it, because the one time you ignore a tip is the one time it is real, and you will wear that mistake like a wet coat for the rest of your career. So the case grows heavy with paper, and heavy cases move slowly. The third reason is identification and timeline work, the quiet grind nobody likes to talk about. Identifying victims is not only about giving names, it is about building a life map, where they lived, who they trusted, what phone numbers mattered, what accounts they used, which days they went silent, and which days they were last seen. Each confirmed detail is a plank in a bridge. When you cannot identify someone quickly, that bridge has gaps, and in those gaps, the offender gets distance. Even when you do have names, confirming movements is a different problem. People's lives are not logged like deliveries. Not everyone clocks in. Not everyone has steady housing. Not everyone uses banks, or keeps receipts, or posts their location. Some people move through the world lightly, because they have had to. And that light footprint, while understandable, makes investigation harder. Then there is proving connection. This is the part the public underestimates. It is one thing to believe that multiple victims are linked. It is another thing to prove it in a way that holds up in court. You need more than a shared dumping area. You need more than a vibe. You need evidence that ties acts together and ties those acts to a person. Sometimes that comes from a clear forensic signature, a specific restraint, a specific knot, a specific way of packaging. Those details can suggest one offender, but suggestion is not proof. Defense attorneys love suggestion. They eat it for breakfast, and if the offender used common materials, things you can buy anywhere, it gets harder. A belt is a belt. Tape is tape. You start needing microscopic comparisons, manufacturing marks, rare fibers, distinctive patterns. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you do not. Meanwhile, the case has an uncomfortable extra problem. The question of one offender versus more than one. If you decide early that it is one person, you may try to force all evidence into that shape. If you decide early it is multiple, you may miss the common thread. Either way, early assumptions cast long shadows. You have to hold both possibilities without getting paralyzed. That is a miserable balancing act. It is like trying to carry 2 open cups of coffee across a hallway without spilling either, while someone keeps opening doors in your path. Another reason it stays open is the way the investigation itself changed over the years. Different leadership, different priorities, different levels of cooperation between agencies. You do not need the ugly details to understand the effect. When continuity breaks, the story of the case breaks. New people have to learn old facts. Old decisions have to be rechecked. Relationships with informants and families have to be rebuilt. And during all that, the public keeps asking, why is nothing happening? Things are happening. They are just happening in slow rooms. There is also the issue of digital evidence and the era it comes from. In the early 2010s, people used prepaid phones more commonly and used them in a way that left fewer permanent links. Social media existed, but it was not the same ecosystem of constant location data that it is now. Some sites that hosted escort advertisements have since changed, moved, been seized, been shut down, or lost records. Some data was never kept long enough. Some data was kept, but retrieving it required time that the case did not have in its earliest frantic phase. Even with records, you face the practical problem of volume. If an offender contacted multiple victims through burner phones, you might be staring at hundreds of numbers, many of which are dead ends. You start doing pattern analysis, repeated contact windows, similar call durations, similar tower activity. The work becomes statistical in the quiet way, the way you sort socks by color in low light. It can point you toward a suspect pool. It rarely hands you a face. And then there is the last, simplest reason, the one you learn to say out loud without shame. Certainty is expensive. To arrest someone is to start a clock. From that moment, every mistake matters more. Every missing report becomes a problem. Every evidence handling gap becomes a defense argument. Prosecutors do not want interesting suspects. They want solid cases. They want proof that will survive a jury and survive the slow gnawing scrutiny that follows high-profile trials. So you wait longer than the public wants. You test again. You double-check. You build and rebuild. You hope for the one piece that ties everything down. DNA that matches, a witness who finally steadies, a phone record that connects, a confession with details only the offender could know. And you do all of it while the world keeps moving. Families keep aging. Detectives retire. Witnesses die. Memories fade. The brush grows and gets cut back, grows and gets cut back, like the landscape itself is breathing. This is why it still feels open. Not because nobody cares, not because nobody worked, because truth can be stubborn and quiet and resistant to being made into a clean story. You can see it in the way the file reads, page after page of effort, with gaps that feel like missing teeth, a list of names, a list of locations, a list of tips. And then the same sentence in different forms repeated over years. Unable to determine, unable to confirm, insufficient evidence. Those phrases sound cold, but they are honest. They are what a case looks like when it refuses to give you the final inch. And the cruel part is that sometimes the final inch is not clever. It is not cinematic. It is a small administrative thing. A sample that sat untested because the lab had a backlog. A note that was misfiled. A witness who was too scared to speak until their life changed. A database that did not exist yet. You have seen cases move because of something as ordinary as a traffic stop. Years later, that led to a DNA swab, that led to a match, that led to a name. You have also seen cases never move at all because the ordinary thing never happened. So you stay patient with the possibility that the Shoreline case will shift, not from one grand revelation, but from one modest detail finally being noticed in the right way. And in the meantime, the case stays open in the way a door stays slightly ajar in a quiet house. Not enough to panic, just enough to keep you listening. You start thinking about how investigators, when they get tired of staring at the same photos and the same maps, go back to basics. They do not chase theories, they chase lists. Who had access to that road at those hours? Who worked nights nearby? Who owned property close enough to know the turnoffs? Who had a history of violence? Who used burner phones in patterns that look familiar? Who traveled between certain points on the island like it was routine? Routine is always the word. Not brilliance, not madness. You write those routines down because routines can be cross-referenced. A person who commuted the same route for years is a person who could stop without getting lost. A person who worked in construction or utilities or delivery is a person who could have a reason to be on the road at odd times. A person who lived in one place and had connections in another could explain why remains appear in different areas. None of this is an accusation. It is the slow sorting of possibility, the only honest way you can work when the evidence does not point neatly. And as you sit with those lists, you realize another reason cases stay open: the human desire to make one villain hold all the darkness. People want one offender because one offender is narratively satisfying. A single figure to blame, a single set of motives, a single ending. But reality is rarely that considerate. Reality can be messier. Sometimes a dumping ground becomes a dumping ground because more than one person notices it is ignored. Sometimes one offender dominates and other tragedies sit nearby like unrelated stones. Sometimes investigators cannot tell at first. because the environment levels differences, sanding down details until everything looks vaguely similar. That is the coastline again, editing, rearranging, blurring. So you keep the question open without making it dramatic. You treat it like a practical fork in the road. One path leads to building a profile of a serial offender with consistent methods. The other path leads to treating the area as a location connected to multiple offenders and multiple storylines, each needing its own work. Either path is slow. Both are exhausting. The thing people forget is that investigators do not get to choose which path is true. They only choose which path to test first. And all of this is still circling the simple question you came back with. What keeps it open? The answer in plain language is that the case needs a hook that holds. A name tied to a phone pattern. A vehicle tied to a location. A piece of physical evidence tied to a person. Something that can stand in front of 12 jurors and not wobble. Until then, the case is a landscape of almosts. Almost a timeline. Almost a suspect. Almost a pattern strong enough to say, beyond doubt, this is one person. Almost enough to say, beyond doubt, these victims are connected the same way. Almost is where cold cases live. You keep working anyway because you have seen almost become enough. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes a change in technology. Sometimes it takes one person, somewhere, deciding they cannot carry a secret anymore. And that thought, the idea of the secret carrier, pulls you back toward the human side again. Not the victims this time, the people around them. The people who might know something and have been sitting on it for years like a stone in their shoe. You picture the kinds of knowledge that exist around crimes. The overheard comment, the sudden new car, the unexplained absence, the joke that lands wrong, the person who always insists too hard that they are innocent of something nobody accused them of. Those are not proof either. They are the soft signals that make detectives circle names in pencil. You also think about fear and how it slows everything down. Not movie fear, practical fear. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being dragged into court. Fear of admitting you were in a place you were not supposed to be. Fear of police themselves. Sometimes, especially for people who have learned that help does not always feel like help. Fear makes witnesses quiet. Quiet makes cases slow. So the case stays open, held in place by weathered evidence, bureaucratic lag, and human hesitation. It is not one dramatic reason. It is a stack of modest reasons piled neatly until they feel like a wall. And you keep returning to the wall, running your hand along it, looking for the loose brick. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes from working something like this. It is not the fatigue of gore. It is the fatigue of repetition. Reading the same interview transcripts, looking at the same maps, listening to the same rumors, dressed in new voices. You go back to the evidence list again because it does not change its story. Even when people do, you look at where remains were found. You look at dates of disappearance. You look at what was known about last contacts. You look at which details repeat and which details refuse to repeat. Repeatable details are gold. Non-repeatable details might be noise, or they might be the truth refusing to simplify itself. You learn to respect both, and this is where your mind, tired but stubborn, starts to narrow in on what investigators often do when a case will not close. They reframe the question. Not who did it at first, That question is too big and too hungry. They ask smaller questions. What kind of access did the offender need? What kind of time window? What kind of privacy? What kind of confidence? What mistakes would be most likely? What habits would show up? What would the offender do that a normal person would never think to do? Small questions do not feel heroic. They feel like counting coins. But coin counting is how you eventually realize someone has been stealing from the register. You take your small questions back to the shoreline. You imagine the offender driving at night. You imagine where they would pull off. You imagine how long they would be exposed to passing traffic. You imagine whether they would use a flashlight or rely on moonlight or know the terrain well enough to move without either. You imagine the sound, the wind, the occasional car rushing past, briefly loud, then gone. A person doing something illegal in that brush would have to tolerate that sound without flinching. They would have to keep working while the world continued around them. That kind of calm is not supernatural. It is practiced. Practice suggests repetition. Repetition suggests a person who did not get caught early. And that circles you back to the same frustration. If someone repeated acts like this, why did it take so long to identify them or to build a case strong enough to hold them? Because repetition alone does not generate evidence. It can actually reduce evidence if the offender learns, if they adjust, if they watch the news and modify their behavior the way you modify your route when there is road construction. Criminals are not always smart, but they can be adaptive, the way any human can be adaptive when motivated. So you keep the tone calm, you keep the thoughts steady, and you accept that the open feeling of the case is not a mystery in itself. It is what happens when many small uncertainties overlap. You are left, for now, with the sensation of an investigation that has done a lot and still wants one more thing. One more solid link, one more detail that does not blur. And as you sit with that, you find yourself drifting back toward the case materials again, toward the parts that can be explained without drama, the parts that quietly shape everything. The timeline gaps, the call records, the way a single number can appear and disappear, and the way those disappearances sometimes mean more than the calls themselves. A number that disappears is not romantic, it is administrative. It is a prepaid phone bought with cash, activated, used, and then treated like a gum wrapper. It is a person who understood that your modern life leaks data the way an old roof leaks rain, and who learned early to put a bucket under the right drip. You sit with the call logs long enough, and your eyes start doing that thing where they stop seeing digits and start seeing rhythm. Short calls that feel like checking availability, longer calls that feel like negotiation. Gaps that look like travel time, a sudden silence that is either a dead battery or a choice. And you remember the ugly limitation: call detail records are not a diary. They do not tell you what was said. They tell you that something happened, and when and between which two endpoints. They are receipts for conversations you cannot hear. So you build your board anyway, because that is what you do when the room gives you nothing but paper. You pin names, you pin dates, you pin phone numbers. You draw a line when two things touch. Then you realize the problem. Your lines multiply like weeds. Because if victims were contacted through escort advertisements, then yes, there may be a common caller. But there are also hundreds of one-time callers, people whose involvement is not murder. It is a late-night decision they regret, or do not regret, but would rather not discuss with a detective who is holding a clipboard like a moral judgment. You spend hours separating the ordinary from the dangerous, which sounds simple until you remember what ordinary looks like. Ordinary looks like everyone, and you keep running into the same frustrating truth. The offender is not required to be clever. He only has to be brief. He only has to keep his contact with the system shallow. A burner phone that lives for a week does not build a history. A car that drives a dark road at the right hour does not collect witnesses. A person who chooses victims on the edge of protection does not trigger alarms quickly. The whole structure is built on the expectation that missing people will not be treated as urgent, at least not at first. Congratulations. You have found the business model of cruelty. It is not complicated. It is just cynical. So you widen the lens, because call logs alone can make you feel like you are staring at a night sky and trying to name one specific star. You start looking at systems around the calls. If a phone number keeps appearing in connection with multiple victims, you ask where it was purchased. That sounds simple until you remember how retail works. A prepaid phone can be bought at a pharmacy, a big box store, a gas station, a corner shop with dusty candy near the register. The receipts may be long gone. The cameras may have overwritten. The clerk may not even remember what day it is. Even if you find the store, you still have to find the moment, a time window, a person on grainy video, a face that is mostly hood and shadow. Then you get to play the oldest game in law enforcement. Is that a beard or just a bad camera? You try to anchor the phone to something more solid. A pattern of cell tower connections, for example. Again, it sounds like science fiction. In reality, it is a rough sketch. A phone connects to the nearest tower, usually, but terrain matters, congestion matters, weather can even matter. You get a blob of geography, not a pinpoint. Still, blobs can overlap if a number consistently lights up towers near a certain town. At certain hours, you can start asking, what kind of person is there at that time? Working? Driving? Visiting? Living? That is not proof, but it is direction. Direction is what keeps you from going numb. And there is another quiet thing. In a case like this, you are not only looking for what happened on the beach road, you are looking for what happened before the beach road. The contact, the meeting, the place where someone got into a vehicle, the last moment when a life was still moving under its own power. Because the dumping ground is rarely the murder scene, it is the disposal scene. It is the final chore. So you take the coastline out of the center of the board for a moment and you put the surrounding towns back in. The motels, the parking lots, the streets with late night traffic and no one paying attention. The houses where neighbors hear a door at 2 a.m. and decide it is not their business. You look for patterns that do not require a confession to exist. Were the meetings arranged in the same way? Was the language and messages similar? Did victims mention a client who wanted unusual privacy? Did anyone report being driven somewhere unexpected? Did anyone survive an encounter and describe a voice, a mannerism, a vehicle smell, the kind of detail that sticks because it is mundane? a vehicle that smells like disinfectant, a dashboard cluttered with work papers, a ring that catches on the steering wheel, a tone of voice that sounds practiced, like customer service. Those details matter because killers are often easier to identify by their habits than by their violence. Violence is what they hide. Habits are what they forget to hide. But even habits can be slippery because memory is not an evidence locker. Witnesses do not store details neatly. They store feelings. The feeling of dread, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of a wrong turn. And you have to translate feelings into facts without insulting the person who is trying to help you. That is a gentle art. It is also exhausting, so you keep working your way through the ordinary obstacles. You request records, you wait, you get a stack of pages with half the names misspelled. You call back, you correct, you wait again. You learn, once more, that justice is not a sword, it is a stapler. And as the paperwork stacks, you start noticing another kind of disappearance, not of phone numbers, but of ownership. Who had this case? When? Who logged which tips? Who made which decisions? Because long investigations develop sediment layers. Early assumptions get buried under later work. Old leads are rediscovered like fossils. Sometimes you find a note that makes you stare at the wall for a full minute because you cannot believe nobody followed it up. Sometimes there is a reason nobody followed it. Sometimes the reason is just everybody was tired. A large case can be like a house with too many rooms. People keep checking the same hallway because it is familiar, while the door at the end stays shut. So you do the unglamorous thing. You open old doors. You reread interviews. You listen to recorded calls with a tired ear. You look for the part that makes someone hesitate, the half-second pause that suggests they are choosing words. You do not do it because you think you will hear a hidden confession. You do it because you are looking for inconsistency. Humans can fake stories, but they struggle to fake time. They struggle to fake the natural flow of remembered events. A liar tends to be too smooth, too chronological. A truth teller forgets. They circle back. They correct themselves. They say, wait, no, that was Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. That messiness is often the only honest thing in the room. And the Gilgo case, for years, had a lot of rooms. People on the outside asked why it was not solved, and people on the inside kept dealing with the same slow friction. Multiple discoveries, multiple victims, multiple possible connections. A single narrative would not hold. When you cannot make one narrative, you start making smaller ones. One cluster becomes its own file. Another cluster becomes another file. You build parallel investigations that sometimes speak to each other and sometimes do not. And every time you think you have a clean boundary, the evidence nudges you and says, not so fast. Because geography connects things even when people do not. A barrier island is not a fortress. It is a ribbon of land with choke points, bridges, causeways, limited ways in and out. That matters to an offender because limited routes can feel safer. Fewer options for a wrong turn. Fewer options for being seen wandering. But those same routes also matter to investigators because limited routes can be watched. In later years, license plate readers became more common and traffic cameras improved. But early on, in the time window that matters most, you are often left with the old tools: eyewitnesses, toll records, hotel registries, credit card trails if you are lucky. And luck is a factor nobody likes to admit because it makes the work feel unfair. But luck is real. Cases turn on it. A suspect gets pulled over for a broken taillight and their nervousness triggers a search. A witness happens to remember a decal on a bumper. A store clerk kept a receipt roll longer than policy required. A lab tech decides to rerun a sample because something looks odd. Those are small things. They are also the difference between a file that closes and a file that stays open for decades. In the Gilgo case, one of the long-running public frustrations was the sense that there were pieces, but not the final assembly. That can happen when the evidence answers the wrong questions. You can know where remains were found and still not know where the person was taken from. You can know the likely season a body was placed and still not know the exact day. You can know a phone number was used and still not know who bought the phone. Evidence loves to give you likely. Court loves beyond a reasonable doubt. Those two phrases do not always get along. So you develop a relationship with uncertainty. You keep it close, like a damp coat you never fully dry. You learn to work inside it. And that is why detectives often lean on what I call the quiet helpers. Databases, patterns, cross-checks, the boring, modern siege weapons. NamUs, for example, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, is one of those tools that does not feel dramatic. It is a place where missing person reports can be compared with unidentified remains across jurisdictions. It is not glamorous. It is a spreadsheet with grief attached. But a spreadsheet can do something humans cannot. It can remember everything at once. So you enter data, heights, dental work, scars, jewelry, clothing descriptions, locations, dates. You wait for a match that might never come or might arrive years later when a family submits DNA or when a missing person report is finally entered properly. And that brings you back to one of the most important and most misunderstood tools in modern investigations: genetic genealogy. Now, in calm, plain language, genetic genealogy is the thing you do when you have DNA but no name. You take a profile, usually from crime scene evidence or remains, and you compare it to people who have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to certain databases, often for ancestry research. You look for relatives, not suspects, second cousins, third cousins, distant branches. From there, you build family trees. Slowly, you follow records, birth certificates, obituaries, old addresses. You narrow down to individuals who fit the right age, the right sex, the right geography. It is not magic. It is paperwork with a new starting point. And it has solved cases that sat cold for 30 years. It has also created arguments about privacy and consent, because it turns out humans enjoy science until it points back at them. In a complex case like Gilgo, this tool can matter in multiple ways. It can help identify victims who were once unnamed. It can help tie a suspect to evidence if a usable DNA sample exists. It can also help eliminate people who were wrongly suspected, which is not as satisfying as an arrest, but is still a kind of mercy. But the tool has limits. DNA degrades in the environment. Samples can be partial, mixed, contaminated. And even if you have a clean profile, You might not find relatives in databases if the person comes from a family line that never tested. So again, almost enough to narrow it, almost enough to name someone, almost enough to knock on a door with confidence. You get used to almost, but you never get comfortable with it. And while all this quiet science advances, the human world keeps shifting. Victims' families push for attention. Reporters push for angles. Politicians push for credit. Different agencies push against each other sometimes because pride is a stubborn thing and careers are fragile. You do not need to turn it into a soap opera to understand the effect. Every push introduces heat. Heat can melt cooperation. Heat can also melt secrecy. It depends on where it lands. Meanwhile, the case sits in the background of Long Island life like a low-frequency hum. People still drive Ocean Parkway. They still go to the beach. They still bring their kids to the sand and pretend the dunes are just dunes. But at night, when the road empties, you know what the brush can hold. You cannot unknow it. That is why, when you return to the central question, why it stays open, you keep landing on the same practical obstacles: time, environment, volume, and the challenge of connecting data to a human being with a name and an address. And yet, even with all that, you also know something else. Cases rarely stay open because nothing happened. Cases stay open because something happened, but not in a way that leaves clean fingerprints. So, you keep thinking about the offender again, gently, like you are trying not to startle a nocturnal animal. If the offender was local, he had to feel safe enough to return more than once. That suggests he did not fear being seen on that road. That suggests he had a reason to be there, or at least a reason that looked normal. If he was not local, he had to be confident enough to navigate a strange landscape at night. That suggests planning or familiarity gained through work, travel, or repeated visits. Either way, the person you are imagining is not a phantom. He is a driver. He buys gas. He pays tolls. He has a phone, even if he swaps it. He leaves traces, even if they are small. Your job is to find the trace that is thick enough to hold. Sometimes that trace is not DNA. Sometimes it is behavior. A person who inserts themselves into the investigation, a person who follows the news too closely, a person who calls in tips that are oddly specific, a person who makes a joke about the case that is not quite a joke, but that requires someone to notice and to document and to keep a note. Because the future version of you, years later, will be grateful for any scrap of context. And this is where we can say something calmly without inflaming the room. High-profile cases can attract noise predators, people who want attention, people who want to confess to things they did not do, people who want to accuse others, people who want to sell a story. You spend time in long investigations filtering that out. It is like trying to sleep while a neighbor keeps testing a car alarm. The sound is not relevant, but it still keeps pulling your focus. False confessions happen more than the public wants to believe. Some are mental illness. Some are manipulation. Some are the belief that confession will bring a kind of notoriety. Some are simply the human desire to be part of something large, even if it is terrible. So you treat every confession like a tip, not like truth. You ask for details only the offender would know. You check timelines. You check geography. You check whether the person was even in the right state. Most fall apart quietly, and nobody writes headlines about that. Boring is not clickable. but boring is where you live. And living there long enough teaches you something else. Sometimes the most important evidence is not what you found on the beach. It is what you did not find. No clear murder weapon recovered. No obvious single location where the acts occurred. No reliable eyewitness to a specific abduction. No surveillance clip that captures a face getting out of a car. Absence is not proof, but absence shapes the strategy. Without a primary scene, you rely on secondary traces, telecommunications, financial records, vehicle movement, witness recollections, and you rely on building pressure around a suspect until the walls tighten. Pressure can come from surveillance if you have a person of interest. It can come from interviewing their associates. It can come from digging into their history. But pressure takes time, and time is the one thing cold cases have in abundance, and also the one thing they hate the most, because time makes people forgetful and also complacent. A person who committed violence years ago may start to believe they got away with it. They may loosen up. They may talk. They may keep souvenirs. They may keep routines that investigators can observe. Or they may do the opposite. They may harden. They may isolate. They may move. They may stop offending. They may die. Each possibility changes the odds, and in a case like Gilgo, the offender's status has always been part of the open feeling. The sense that the person could be out there or could be gone, and you do not know which. Not knowing is a special kind of discomfort. It is not fear. It is unfinished business. So, you keep the case warm in the only way you can. You revisit. You re-interview. You update victim identifications. You cross-compare with other jurisdictions. You check whether similar crimes occurred along travel corridors. You look at the map again, and you see how Long Island connects to the rest of the region. Bridges to the city, ferries, airports. A person can be in Manhattan and on Ocean Parkway in a reasonable drive. That matters, because the offender could be someone who moved between worlds, busy streets and empty dunes. And people who move between worlds are often invisible in both, not because they are supernatural, but because everyone assumes they belong somewhere else. You sit with that thought and you let it connect to the earlier detours, the grocery store lot, the apartment hallway. Different places, same principle. Ordinary spaces have blind spots. The blind spot is where the story slips. And once a story slips, it takes work to catch it again. That is why investigators love anything that behaves like a timestamp. Something that does not forget. A toll record, a hotel check-in, a parking ticket, a traffic camera image, even a phone connecting to a tower at a specific minute. These things are not sexy. They are the difference between maybe and here. So you chase them, you issue subpoenas, you get stacks of records, you look for overlaps. If a suspect's phone regularly traveled along Ocean Parkway late at night, that matters. If a suspect's vehicle was recorded near an access point on multiple relevant dates, that matters. If a suspect used the same burner phone provider repeatedly, that matters. But each matters still needs the next one. The chain has to hold, and sometimes the chain breaks in court not because the suspect is innocent, but because the evidence is incomplete. That is the part the public hates. It feels like a technicality. In reality, it is the system doing what it promised, refusing to imprison on vibes. That refusal is both noble and infuriating, depending on which side of grief you sit on. So, the investigation continues. and the case stays open, and you keep turning the same stones with new tools. Now, while your mind is still in the evidence room, let it drift back to the victims again in a soft way, because the victims are not only names, they are also sources of clues. A victim's last days can tell you where the offender reached them. A victim's contacts can tell you which numbers mattered. A victim's routine can tell you what kind of approach worked. Was it a call offering money? A message promising safety? A request for discretion? Offenders do not invent new social dynamics. They exploit old ones. So you study the dynamics without moralizing. You look at how online advertising worked in that era, how meetings were arranged, how cash changed hands, how some victims used safety practices, like check-in calls to friends, and how those practices could fail when someone acted quickly. You also learn, quietly, how often victims carried a private fear of police involvement, not because they loved danger, but because they had learned that reporting can backfire. Arrests, shaming, losing custody, losing housing, losing income. That fear is not theoretical. It is part of the landscape. And the offender, if he was targeting sex workers, would not need to be a criminal mastermind to understand it. He would only need to be observant. He would only need to notice which people were less likely to call for help. That is why victimology matters. It shows you the selection process. And selection is where many offenders reveal themselves, because selection follows preference, and preference follows psychology. Again, not magic, habit. When you see repeated selection of similar victims, you start considering whether the offender had a type, a preference for people who could be controlled, people who needed money quickly, people who were isolated, people who moved between temporary living situations. You do not say that to blame the victim. You say it because it tells you what the offender was shopping for. A predator does not walk into a forest and choose randomly. He chooses what he thinks he can take. That is a hard sentence, and you keep it calm, because calm is how you keep thinking. Now, let the case widen again, just slightly, back to the shoreline. Ocean Parkway at night is not empty. In the absolute sense, there are still cars, there are still patrols. Sometimes, there are still fishermen. There are still people parked in turnouts for reasons they do not want to write down. That means an offender had to accept the possibility of being seen. So you ask, what makes a person accept that risk? Sometimes it is arrogance. Sometimes it is necessity. Sometimes it is the comfort of having done it before without consequence. Repeated success teaches the wrong lesson. It teaches that the world is not watching, and if the world is not watching, you start making mistakes. That is the hope that sits under every cold case. That time makes the offender sloppy and makes the evidence sharper, at least in relative terms. New labs can extract profiles from older samples. New software can compare patterns across more data. New databases can connect relatives who did not exist in the system before. Even new investigators can help because they do not carry the same assumptions. Fresh eyes are not a slogan. They are a practical tool. A new detective may read an old interview and notice that someone used the wrong term for a location, or that a witness described a car in a way that matches a known model, or that a suspect had an unexplained work route that crossed the dumping area. Small observations can pivot a case, but pivots still need something to pivot onto. You need a target that is not just a silhouette, and that is where the Gilgo case for many years sat. between silhouette and target. You may have had names of interest. Many investigations do. You may have had suspicions about certain individuals based on behavior, geography, employment, or rumor. But suspicion does not belong in court. Suspicion belongs in the notebook, written in pencil, with the understanding that pencil is erasable for a reason. So you keep building quietly, step by step, and in the middle of this building, you keep encountering a subtle complication. The case is actually two types of work at once. One type is solving the crimes, linking victims, identifying offenders. The other type is managing the public and political pressure around them. That second type is not supposed to matter, but it does. It changes resource allocation. It changes leadership decisions. It changes how cautious agencies become about sharing information. Sometimes information is held back for good reason, to protect the integrity of the investigation. Sometimes it is held back because nobody wants to look bad. The file does not always tell you which is which, so you learn to read between lines. You look at what was released, when. You look at which details were emphasized and which were kept vague. You look at how language shifts over time. Language shifts are clues. When officials say, "We believe these cases are connected," that is one level of confidence. When they say, "We can confirm," that is another. When they stop using a phrase, it can mean the evidence changed or the strategy did. And strategy is its own kind of evidence because it reveals what investigators think they have. Still, you do not let the public language hypnotize you. You go back to the things that do not care about press conferences, the physical placements, the timelines, the communications, and there, you find yourself circling one of the hardest questions in this case: the mix of victims. Some remains found in the broader area did not match the same pattern as the Gilgo 4. Different circumstances, different likely timelines, different victim profiles. That is why the one offender versus multiple question keeps returning like a tide. Because if you push too hard for one offender, you risk connecting tragedies that are not connected. That is bad for truth, and it is bad for court. Defense attorneys love nothing more than a prosecution that overreaches. Overreach creates reasonable doubt. If you split too hard into multiple offenders, you risk missing a single pattern that actually does exist. That is bad for solving, and it is bad for families who want clarity. So you do what investigators often do when a case refuses to choose. You build conditional models. If it is one offender, then certain behaviors should appear across cases, similar contact methods, similar disposal choices, similar time windows. If it is multiple offenders, then clusters should separate cleanly by geography, by method, by victim type, by timeline. You test these models against the evidence. Testing is slow. It involves comparing lab reports, some of which were written years apart by different people using slightly different standards. It involves comparing evidence photographs taken in different weather and light. It involves re-examining items that sat in storage, sealed, waiting for the day someone had time. You open boxes, you log openings, you wear gloves, you breathe through the faint smell of old packaging and salt. Evidence rooms have their own atmosphere: dry air, cardboard, plastic, a hint of disinfectant, the feeling of time stacked on shelves. And you stand there, in your mind, holding a sealed bag, knowing that everything depends on what is inside, and also knowing that inside might be nothing. Sometimes You open a bag and find an item that was once meaningful, a piece of jewelry, a belt, a scrap of fabric. The item is quiet. It does not accuse anyone. It simply exists and waits for you to interpret it correctly. You look for fibers, for hairs, for manufacturing marks, for anything that can be compared to a known source. Fiber analysis, in plain terms, is the idea that tiny threads can transfer between surfaces when people or objects touch. A carpet fiber can cling to clothing. A pet hair can cling to upholstery. A distinctive material can indicate a vehicle or a home environment. But fiber evidence is not like fingerprints. It is not individual in the same way. It is class evidence, meaning it can tell you the type and sometimes the rarity, but not always the unique origin. So it helps most when it is combined with other things. Again, the chain. You examine knots. If rope or bindings were used, knots can be telling. Certain knots are common in boating, construction, scouting, climbing. A person may tie the way they were taught. They may repeat the same knot because it is muscle memory. But knots are also common knowledge now, thanks to the internet. And in older cases, documentation may not be as precise as you would like. So you treat knot analysis as suggestive. Knot. You look at burlap. If burlap was involved, you ask where burlap is commonly used. Landscaping, construction, erosion control, gardening supply. You check suppliers. You check whether certain weaves are more common in certain industries. This kind of work is not thrilling. It is the detective equivalent of comparing paint swatches under fluorescent light. Still, you do it because sometimes the ordinary object is the thread that leads you out of the maze. And sometimes the ordinary object leads nowhere because the world is full of ordinary objects. That is another reason the case stays open. The offender may have chosen materials that are everywhere on purpose, or he may have chosen them because he was not thinking that far ahead. Either explanation produces the same investigative headache. You keep building, and the case keeps resisting. Now, to keep your mind from tightening around one idea, you let it drift back to those calm side stories again. Not to retell them, but to borrow their lesson. The grocery store case taught you that surveillance is not a guarantee. The apartment building case taught you that quiet scenes can hide abrupt endings. Both taught you that missed timing is a killer in itself. So you ask, where did timing slip in Gilgo? Early on, some victims were missing for long periods before remains were found. That means the first and best window for evidence collection, the first days and weeks, were already gone. And even when a missing person report is filed early, there is often a delay in recognizing the connection between different cases, different towns, different departments, different assumptions about lifestyle. If the system treats certain missing persons as less urgent, the offender gains time. Time to dispose, time to clean, time to discard phones, time to return to normal life. That is not conspiracy. That is the quiet math of attention. And attention is a limited resource. So the case remains open, and you keep returning to the same patient work, connecting disappearances to discoveries, connecting contacts to movements, connecting geography to habit. All of this is what makes the case feel, in a strange way, both huge and small. Huge because of the number of victims and the time span. Small because the solution may hinge on one unremarkable detail. A receipt, a phone purchase, a single consistent tower connection, a witness who finally says, yes, that was the vehicle, and I am sure now. You have seen that kind of hinge before. It does not look like a movie. It looks like a detective staring at a spreadsheet and suddenly stopping because one cell is colored differently. Now, while we are here, in the low light of this case, there is one more practical layer that often gets overlooked: the role of offender risk management. An offender who disposes remains along a public parkway is managing risk in a specific way. He is accepting the risk of passing cars, but reducing the risk of being associated with a private location. He is choosing a place that belongs to everyone, which means it belongs to no one. A private property disposal ties you to land records, neighbors, fences, and future construction. A public strip of brush ties you to nothing obvious. That choice is strategic, even if the offender is not consciously articulating it. It is the kind of strategy a person develops by living in a place and understanding where the eyes are and where they are not. You can call it planning, but sometimes it is just familiarity sharpened into opportunity. And if you are trying to identify such a person, you start looking for people whose lives intersect that strip of land without raising eyebrows. People who drive that road repeatedly for work or for habit. People who have a reason to pull over. People whose vehicles blend in. Work trucks, commuter cars, anything that would not be memorable at midnight. You also look for people who can compartmentalize, because this kind of offending requires a person to walk back into daylight and pretend to be normal. Compartmentalization is a psychological skill, and many people have it in mild forms. They use it to get through stressful jobs, to smile at customers when their personal life is falling apart. In a predator, that same skill becomes a mask. So, you look for masks that slip. Domestic violence history can be a clue because it shows a person who uses control and force. Sex crime history can be a clue because it shows a person who crosses consent boundaries. Employment that provides access to victims can be a clue because it shows opportunity. But none of these are guarantees. Many violent people never become serial offenders. Many serial offenders have no recorded history because they were careful, lucky, or simply not reported. You cannot arrest a profile. You can only use it to prioritize. And prioritization is everything when you have too much data. So you prioritize and you keep the work slow and steady. At some point, you stop thinking of the case as a single mystery and start thinking of it as an ecosystem. Victims, offender, geography, technology, bureaucracy, public pressure, all interacting. In an ecosystem, change happens when one element shifts. A new technology emerges. A new witness comes forward. A new investigator revisits a neglected lead. A new database connects a sample to a family. These shifts are quiet. They do not announce themselves. They arrive like a letter in the mail, stamped with a date you cannot ignore. And that is the feeling you hold on to as you move through the late years of the investigation. The sense that the case is not static. It is slowly being reinterpreted as tools improve and as people change. You keep your expectations modest. You do not demand the perfect clue. You just keep looking for the next usable one. Because when a case finally closes, it often closes in pieces. First, you identify a victim who had been unnamed. That changes the timeline. That changes the contact list. That changes the suspect pool. Then you link a phone number to a purchase location. That changes the geography. That changes the surveillance search. Then you link a vehicle description to a person with a relevant route. That changes your interviews. That changes who you watch. Then you get a DNA hit, or a partial hit, or a family tree that narrows the field to a handful. That changes everything. But you do not get the last step without all the earlier steps. And those earlier steps are made of boring work. Which brings you back, once again, to why this file stayed open so long. The boring work took time, and time wore down the easy evidence. Now, while you are still holding this thought, let your mind drift to something that seems small, but is not. The difference between an investigation and a prosecution. Investigators can live with uncertainty longer than prosecutors can. Investigators can keep chasing maybe because their job is to find. Prosecutors need provable because their job is to win a case ethically. That means there can be periods where investigators feel close, but prosecutors will not authorize the leap. No charges, no arrest, no dramatic moment, just more building. And the public reads that as failure when it is often restraint. Restraint is hard to sell. It is also sometimes the only reason a case survives in court once it finally arrives. So the file remains open, and the coastline keeps breathing wind over sand, and you keep returning to the same quiet hope that one day a small connection will harden into something that cannot be argued away. And as you sit with that hope, you notice your attention shifting again, away from the technical tools, away from the call logs, and toward the most unpredictable element of all, people. Because sooner or later, in a case like this, the evidence does not solve it alone. Someone speaks. Someone slips arrested for something else and decides to trade information for mercy. Someone in a family finds an old phone, an old notebook, an old photograph, and realizes what they are looking at. The human world leaks secrets in strange ways. And the question becomes, what makes a person finally talk? Sometimes it is guilt, real guilt, the kind that wakes you at 3 a.m. when the house is quiet. Sometimes it is anger. A relationship breaks and a spouse decides to burn the other person down. Sometimes it is boredom. Weirdly enough, people get older and they stop protecting old loyalties. Sometimes it is money, because money makes people brave. You cannot predict which one it will be. You can only prepare to catch it when it happens. So you keep your tip lines staffed. You keep your old files organized. You keep your evidence preserved. You keep your relationships with families alive, even when you have nothing new to tell them, because silence feels like abandonment. This is the part of policing that does not fit in television episodes. The part where you call someone and say, "We are still working," and you can hear in their breath that they have heard the same sentence too many times. You say it anyway because you have nothing else honest to offer. And then, one day, sometimes you do have something else. A new test result, a new identification, a new lead. Not closure, not yet. Just movement. Movement is enough to keep you going. Now, before we move deeper into that human world of tips and confessions and late-speaking witnesses, you let yourself linger for a moment on the shoreline again. Because it matters that this place is both obvious and hidden. In daylight, you can see the road, the dunes, the scrub. You can see how close it is to everything, to neighborhoods, to beach parking lots. to the ordinary infrastructure of a heavily populated region. At night, the same place becomes a tunnel. Headlights carve out a small reality. Everything outside the beams becomes irrelevant and therefore invisible. You understand in that moment how a person could do something terrible here without feeling watched. Not because nobody is there, but because everyone is passing through, sealed in their cars, focused on their own lives. That is one of the bleakest truths of modern life. We are surrounded and still alone. And if you are the kind of offender who thrives on that, you do not need a remote cabin. You need a shoulder of road that people treat like nothing. The case lives in that nothing. You keep walking through it, mentally, the way you have walked through it for years, and you keep waiting for the moment when the nothing finally gives up a name, not as an ending, as the next workable step, because in this kind of investigation, the next step is all you ever truly have. And the next step, more often